Здравствуйте, как дела? And the rest will be in English.
Thank you.
What's the difference between truth and fiction? Fiction has to make sense. The truth, we don't know. But we'll talk about the truth, the tormenting truth that Tchaikovsky had through his whole life, the ultimate conflict of the Tsars, what to do with Tchaikovsky. It's really the story of the Kremlin versus Tchaikovsky. But it's best to start with the Tsars. Tsar Nicholas I. Tsar Nicholas was a terrifying Tsar. He was anyone that he felt disagreed with him, anyone that he felt was against the national interests, it was execution. Gay was perhaps the worst. He was very closely allied with the Russian Orthodox Church. Gay was transferred to Siberia, where you worked yourself into a starving, slow freezing death. If you were lucky, so to speak, it was immediate execution. When Tchaikovsky was born under this Tsar in 1840, he lived through his, what we would be calling early high school years, his freshman, his sophomore years, knowing that if he was found out, he'd be a candidate for execution. And there was no doubt about it. They were getting rid of anyone that they thought was a blot on the Russian image. He was in an all-male school studying jurisprudence, surrounded by men, and he had friends there, hookups, so to speak. Alexei Aputkin was a friend of his. He wrote poetry. Tchaikovsky, as a young teenager, wrote music to this poetry, to Alexei. We don't know what they did, but one can only assume this was, 13, 14. But when Tchaikovsky turned 15, somebody presented Tsar Nicholas I with a music box. He took the music box, he walked into the public square with it, very happy to have somebody give him an honor. It blew up and he was dead. It's the Russian thing to do. Tsar Nicholas I was a great interest in serfdom. Serfs, if you're not clear about this, is sort of a voluntary slavery. You sign a contract for life saying that you will be a slave to the landowner in return for some kind of protection against marauding thieves. It was a mutual interest for a while, but you were locked in for life, and essentially you were living a slave's life. When his son took power, Tsar Alexander II took power, he was a very liberal Tsar, very hopeful. He gave hope to the people, and the first thing he did was eliminate serfdom. There were still laws about gays on the books, but it was rarely enforced. Tchaikovsky was 15 years old when this happened. Here, all of a sudden, life changed for gays in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the two major cities at that time. Tchaikovsky, as a young man, started his career changing from jurisprudence for a civil service job and going into music. During the reign of Alexander II, he wrote 4 symphonies, he wrote the Russian Easter Overture, wrote lots and lots of stars, lived really the middle of his life there, and became Russia's rock star. Kind of their Elton John, but not their Elton John. And he became very famous. He had a patron, Nadia von Meck, a very rich widow, one of the richest people in Moscow, who gave him monthly allowance, allowed him to not worry about finances and do his composing. In 1881, Tchaikovsky was 41 years old. There was a 41. There was a big parade in the center square, and Tsar Alexander II was in the royal carriage. There were a lot of people around. This was a big event, and someone walked over to the carriage with a very intricately carved music box. Catching on? Gave it to him through the window. He took it on his lap. The carriage went away. The carriage blew up. That was the end of Tsar Alexander II. It's the Russian thing to do. Tsar Alexander III was worse than his grandfather. He trumped his grandfather. He was narcissistic. He was insecure. The moment he took power, he was afraid of losing power. He had to create distractions to keep the people from rebelling. Populism was growing in Russia. This was in 1861, 1862. Populism was growing. Have a seat.
Thank you. Sorry.
For his inauguration, he commissioned the most famous composer they had at the time, Tchaikovsky, to write the Coronation March. Commissioned in those days was not the same as it means now. Tchaikovsky really didn't care for this piece. He had no choice. He wrote the Coronation March. It's a nice piece, not his best. But he was barbaric. He had to create a distraction, and the first thing he did was blame it on the Jews. This is a kind of a standard thing to do. And he expelled the Jews from Moscow. After he felt they were clear of Jews in Moscow, whatever, went to St. Petersburg, went from Minsk to Pinsk, and expelled Jews wherever they could. When that was done, he went to the little villages, the shtetls, and the Cossacks plowed them down. Actually, my grandfather lived in such a little village. Later on, that was plowed down. Things were still not going well. And in his infinite narcissism and his feeling that things were not going well, getting worse, he enlisted the power of the Russian Orthodox Church. This was a serious move for gays. The Russian Orthodox Church had a price, and their price was whatever they wanted. And being homosexual was about the worst thing they could do. Both Fred and I are Russian. Fred has told me the story once of a Russian church recently that did a commitment ceremony, and the people of the village said the only way to sanctify the church was to burn it down, and they did. That's Russia today. There were still rumblings of revolution in Russia, and the next thing that Tsars decided to do was increase the cultural center of Russia, make them the cultural center of the world, not the backwater that it was. And he decided to have a culture war. And who did he pick? Paris. This was the mid-1880s, La Belle Epoque, the beautiful era. All the artists of the world were going to Paris, and Tsar Alexander III decides it's going to be Moscow. About 1889, the centennial of the French Revolution, Paris unveiled the Eiffel Tower. The greatest thing in the world, the tallest building in the world, actually until the Chrysler building was put up. Tsar Alexander III was despondent. He had lost the culture war to Paris once again. But on May 5th, in 1891, Carnegie Hall opened. And in preparation for Carnegie Hall opening, Andrew Carnegie wanted nothing but the greatest musician in the world to conduct the opening. He wanted Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. They sent a communications sent the communications to Moscow, to the Tsar, and he was ecstatic. I mean, he peed in his pants with joy. Here was a shot to fire across the bow of Paris. But there was a big conflict. Oh, by the way, he said to Tchaikovsky, you can go, but you must open Carnegie Hall with the Coronation March, my Coronation March. Not the piece that Tchaikovsky would have picked. That's what opened Carnegie Hall, the Coronation March. It was known that Tchaikovsky was gay. It was known in closed circles. So here we have a situation. The Tsar is going to send the most popular person now, the most popular musician in the world, to New York City alone? No way. So they sent an entourage, sort of the precursor of the KGB, to watch him. Now, Tchaikovsky had a gay brother, Modest. So a lot of what we know, are from letters that he wrote to his gay brother. Other letters that he wrote, there's nothing in it about any allusions at all to gay. But to his brother, there were code words. He speaks about loving New York City. New York City is unlike any place he's ever been. People smile on the street. They came over and shook my hand. Someone hugged me. It's utterly wonderful. And he met the Greeks and the friends of Greeks. Today we call that Dorothy and the friends of Dorothy. But then it was the friends of Greeks. That he writes in his letter. New York City was perfect. There was still the death penalty. That was still on the books. And Tsar Alexander III took that with pride. Not only were there gay executions, but he made that a public event. There were gay meetings in the public square, sort of like stonings. But here he has New York City, Tchaikovsky on his own, sort of speak. What could go wrong? Tchaikovsky was known to solicit male prostitutes in the inner circle. He was known to go for the lower classes. He was known to be attracted to sailors. They watched him. He went down to the docks. In fact, he wrote to his brother about going down to the docks of New York City, I suppose the meatpacking district. He was reviewed for the opening concert as being, actually in the newspapers, the Sun, I read the review, a healthy, spirited, proud man, an honor to Moscow. His funeral was 2 years later. We'll come to that. Tsar Alexander III knew gay very well. He had a gay brother. Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich was gay. It was hidden, so they thought. He was deferential to the Orthodox Church. He had no choice. He was described as being extremely handsome, 6'2", blonde, with emerald green eyes, perfect posture, dressed to the nines. He was hiding being gay. He was assassinated. But Tchaikovsky's romances. By the way, the New York thing went very, very well. Came back to Russia. He was honored and still watched. Now, have to remember now, he came of age during a time where executions were rampant for gays until he was 15. Spent the rest of his life till he was 41 in sort of a liberal environment, and now he's back at 41 in a fairly horrible situation. He really can't hide. He's too famous. Let me talk about his romances a little bit. When he was 29 years old, he met Edward Zach, a very important name in his life. Edward Zach was 15. This was very typical for Tchaikovsky. He went for younger men, typically 12 to 14 years younger, all of them. Edward Zach was the love of his life. He met him in the spring. He wrote in letters to his brother Modeste, and he mentions the words podach y lubach, lust and love, constantly. So this was a real gay romance. In the autumn of that year, he writes the tone poem Romeo and Juliet. You've all heard it. Whether you think you have or not, you've heard it. One of his most popular works. There is not a single biographer who would contradict that this was written for Edward Zach. It's Romeo and Juliet. It's the conflict, the ultimate conflict. The Montagues and the Capulets, the Sharks and the Jets, love, rejection, society, gay love and social mores, forces in constant conflict. Romeo and Juliet, written for Edward Zach, his 15-year-old lover. And one of his biographers writes, I think he writes beautifully, leading to the end, to the tragic death of two lovers. There's no doubt that he wrote the overture with extraordinary enthusiasm and inspiration for Edward Zach. Here, for the first time, he voiced the main emotional themes of all his subsequent works, the drama of unfulfilled and frustrated love and of impossible youthful passion, consumed by omnipresent death. In the case of Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet, an intimate link can be seen between this fervent piece of music and a secret drama unfolding in the composer's life at the time of its composition. It portended things to come. A few years later, Edward Zach committed suicide. He shot himself in the head. And Tchaikovsky never, for the rest of his life, was not in love with Edward Zach. He writes in his diary 10, 14 years later, over and over again, about, in the middle of the night, his love for Edward Zach, his dreams, and the images of Edward Zach in almost everyone that he met. In the book Coda, the character Ivan is Edward Zach. I didn't use the name Edward Zach because I wanted it to be the way I wanted it to be. There were a lot of other lovers. He met a violinist, Joseph Kotek. In chapter 2, the violinist is Joseph Kotek. He called him Kotik. Kotik in Russian means pussycat. He was very, very fond of him. And remember Alexander Aputkin from high school years? Well, Alexander Aputkin became morbidly fat, and that was the end of that. He had a valet, 19 years younger than him, lived with him pretty much his whole life. And it was Vladimir Shilovsky. Vladimir Shilovsky was a wealthy young man. He died very soon after Tchaikovsky's funeral. But the ultimate was Bob Davidoff. You don't hear of Bob in Russia. Tchaikovsky's music was autobiographical, all of it, like no other composer. There's no denying that. His last symphony, the Pathétique, which in Russian means passionate, doesn't mean pathetic, was dedicated to Bob Davidoff. Now, dedicating a symphony in those days was a big deal. Dedicating his final symphony to his nephew meant a lot. I'm not sure if Bob Davidoff was gay. He very well might be. I'm not sure if they ever had anything going on between them. Probably not. I'm not sure. But his last symphony, with his everything being autographical, it's not unexpected that this last symphony has been associated with his mysterious death. He wrote that the piece was programmatic. Rimsky-Korsakov begged him, "What's the story?" And he's told Rimsky-Korsakov, Rimsky-Korsakov wrote it down in a letter, he's told me, "You'll figure it out." but nobody knows. Was it a suicide note? We don't know. He premiered it in October 28th. His funeral was a few days later on November 5th. The people that saw it, that wrote about it in the newspaper, said here was a handsome, energetic man, vital and looking towards the future. He was dead a week later, pronounced dead a week later. Symphony number 6, the first movement in itself is a little strange. In the middle of the first movement, unrelated to any music before it, unrelated to any music after it, the trombones play an excerpt from the Russian Mass of the Dead. Out of nowhere. And then the piece continues. But it's the last movement. The last movement is really very strange. Last movements of symphonies, especially Russian symphonies, are usually bombastic. They're blustering, bravado. Not this one. This one starts off with a very sobbing, crying melody. And it would sound like da 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 da. It's unusual because nobody is actually playing it. Let me say that again. No one is actually playing it. The violins, the violas are jumping up and down, and the ear is putting together the high notes. And what you're hearing is the high notes descending, da 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 da. And Tchaikovsky writes about living behind a mask, and here the final movement of his final symphony is hidden behind a mask. Autobiographical? I would say so. If you look at the score, and I don't know, oh, there it is. There's the score. If you can read music, I dare you to find the melody. It's not there. And a sidebar about Eugene Onegin. Eugene Onegin is a little bit of a corny plot. You have two best friends who get into an argument about a woman, and his best friend challenges Eugene Onegin to a duel, pistol duel, knowing that Eugene Onegin is a good shot and he hardly knows how to hold a gun. The scene opens with him on the stage swinging an aria, which is, I'm gonna die. And it goes, da 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 da. There you go. Tchaikovsky is using, in the last movement of his final symphony, a melody that he already knows is, I'm going to die. Let me read two very, very short sections from Coda. This takes place in Tchaikovsky's flat. This is actually a picture of Tchaikovsky's flat, but it's a later flat when he has a little bit of money. This is he and Ivan, Edward Zach. Late one evening, while Peter and Ivan were having a quiet time in each other's arms, there was a knock at the door. Peter put a finger to Ivan's lips to let him know to be quiet. He did not want her to think he was there. Господин Tchaikovsky, his lady called out in a hushed voice. Peter looked at Ivan, his eyes wide. She screeched in the smallest possible whisper as if something might be wrong. Господин Tchaikovsky. Then from a poke of the landlady's toe, the door slowly swung open, causing Peter to freeze as he saw his landlady holding a tray of poppy seed strudel, her eyes wide with fright, the doorway framed an image that Peter feared would cause unwelcome consequences. The landlady stood gaping at Ivan and Peter, who were standing together, not fully dressed, and without saying a word, she gently placed the tray on the floor and turned around. She stood for a moment with the back of the doorway looking up to the heavens. As she trotted down the stairways, mumbling and crossing herself repeatedly in broad sweeps, Peter and Ilyich and Ivan stood frozen in a failed tableau displaying to a cruel and critical audience. Peter looked at Ivan's terrified face and for a brief moment felt the gravity of the encounter. But his soberness vanished quickly and a stifled chuckle cascaded into a giggle and broke into a drunken laugh. Ivan's face glowed and his rosy cheeks nearly eclipsed his sapphire eyes. This was a happy time to be coveted, but their carelessness would have a price. Ivan asked in a cautious voice, "Is this how it'll be, evading every suspecting eye? Will people ever see past the crushing influence of Russian inhumanity?" Peter walked to the other side of the room with his head down, and after a short time turned to Ivan. In one edition of the Beethoven piano sonatas, there's a misprint. A C sharp as printed as a C natural. The printing is so blatantly wrong that any sane pianist would make the correction with little thought. If the correction is not made, the sound is a terrible assault on the ears and the intellect. Nevertheless, one occasionally hears that sonata performed with that wrong note. The pianist would rather have his ears abused with what he must know is wrong than oppose the presumed authority of Ludwig van Beethoven, the great master. The offensive error is repeated in concert again and again by trusting musicians with the fear that disobeying Master Beethoven is beyond their domain of influence. Authority, whether real or perceived, is hard for some to challenge, no matter how it affronts them. This is the Orthodox Church. The second excerpt, Coda has two plots, a contemporary plot and the one you just heard in 19th century Russia. In the contemporary plot, the Kremlin wants any evidence that Tchaikovsky had a gay lover of some time, want that evidence to be destroyed. But Tchaikovsky had written something in his music. And Fred, Alex, and their friend Susan are in the Moscow Conservatory of Music trying to find it. An assassin, Margot, is out to get the music and to kill them for what they know. This is the Moscow Conservatory of Music. This scene takes place in the very upper attic where the top eyebrow windows are. Margot stood fast with both hands holding the gun pointed at Fred. Alex looked down at Fred. Oh, one thing. At the very end of this upper part, across is a catwalk. Alex is hiding on that catwalk. Fred and Susan are on the floor in that place, and Margot has just burst into that area, not knowing that Alex is up on the catwalk. Margot stood fast with both hands holding the gun pointed at Fred. Alex looked down at Fred, staring at the gun that moved slowly back and forth like a cobra about to strike. Alex watched Susan move slowly away. He put his hand over his mouth and stopped breathing. I'm skipping through this. From the catwalk, Alex glared at Susan's mouth. Don't look up, don't look up, don't look up, don't. He moved his hands back and forth. Do not look up. Susan looked down and Alex breathed a sigh. Alex leaned to move back, but his legs froze by the edge of the catwalk. Where is the music? Margot snarled. Then turning Fred, she said, and where is Alex hiding? She took a few steps towards Fred. Well, she roared. Alex tried not to move as the photographs dropped from his hand. Margot said, you don't have a choice. Give me the music. Fred raised his hand as if that would stop the impending bullet. If we had it, I would give it to you. We have nothing. It was stolen. Margot raised her gun and pointed at Fred's head. Last chance. Fred turned his head away. Alex wanted Susan to make an extraction, but she didn't move or say anything. Susan was frozen, breathing heavily with her mouth opening and closing but uttering not a single word. Margot turned towards Susan, aiming at her chest. Alex looked down at Margot standing under the catwalk. He slowly moved over to a huge wooden box full of manuscripts that was positioned near the edge, aware that the slightest creak would be his death. Alex heard his heartbeat thumping like kettle drums and his breathing like a windstorm. He moved as slowly and noiselessly as possible. He concentrated on sounds from below and coordinated his movement. "Margot, don't," Fred said. Alex nudged the crate an inch. "No more chances," Margot said. The crate made a squeal, moving on the steel grating. Alex backed off, froze, and shut his eyes tight. He tried not to tremble, but that wasn't working. Susan glanced up and coughed loudly, which resonated from the far side of the room. "Thank you, Susan," he thought as he breathed deeply. Alex put his hands onto the crate again and nudged it a bit closer towards the edge. It made no sounds as it moved ever so slightly. Alex prodded the crate nearer to the edge, viewed down at his target, and finally gave it a shove. He stood back as it teetered at the edge for a moment and watched it tip, almost balanced. Then, like the slowness of cold honey, it tilted and with a snarling growl slid the rest of the way off the catwalk. Margot spun around and stared up. She glared at the box as it came straight towards her eyes. Alex inhaled loudly as it seemed to hover in midair, giving Margot enough time to raise her gun. She looked up and fired 3 shots towards Alex. Fred wailed, "No!" And there's more.